I spent most of my life pretending I didn't see him, not because he was cruel, not because he was absent, but because I was ashamed. Ashamed of his worn hands, ashamed of his old truck, ashamed of the quiet way he loved me. When people asked who my father was, I changed the subject. When he called, I said I was busy. And every time I left, I told myself I would make it up to him later. But life doesn't wait for later. On the day I finally returned home, the house was quieter than I remembered, and my father was weaker than I had ever seen him. At that moment, I realized something terrible. Love doesn't disappear when you ignore it. It waits. And sometimes, it waits until it's almost too late. The October rain pounded loudly on the old roof of a house in a small town in Pennsylvania. Drops slid down the window, distorting the view of the cemetery behind the hill, where yesterday they buried the man Claire Wilson had tried for years not to talk about. Her beloved suitcase from New York stood by the door, and on the kitchen table lay a white envelope, her father's will, still unopened. Claire didn't dare touch it, as if the paper could say more than she was ready to hear. She looked out the window and suddenly realized all these years she had been afraid not of poverty, but that the truth about her origins would destroy the ideal version of her life. Dear friends, this story is about shame that comes too early and love that we realize too late. 13 years ago, the cold November wind blew fallen leaves across the yard of an old house on the outskirts of River Falls. Claire Wilson, a 34-year-old successful marketing director at Pulse Strategy, a large New York agency, nervously glanced at her watch. The intercity bus from Manhattan was almost an hour late. She knew her father was already standing by the window, waiting, as always. Claire adjusted the collar of her $2,500 cashmere coat and glanced in the mirror. Perfect makeup, well-groomed hair, restrained elegance. Nothing about her betrayed that she was the daughter of an ordinary plumber from the provinces. Her colleagues, clients, boyfriend, none of them knew that her father had spent half his life repairing pipes, coming home with the smell of chlorine and metal on his hands. "Claire? Claire?" came a familiar voice from the porch. James Wilson stood leaning on the old railing. The worn jacket he had worn since Claire was in school hung loosely on him. His gray hair was tousled, but his eyes shone with sincere joy. "I'm so glad to see you, daughter." Claire smiled tensely and quickly glanced around to see if any of their neighbors had seen them meet. "Hi, Dad," she said quietly, hugging him lightly, almost formally. He smelled of cheap cologne and medicine. "How are you? Does your back hurt?" "It's fine." He waved her off, but she noticed how difficult it was for him to bend over when he reached for her suitcase. "No, I can do it myself," Claire said sharply. Inside the house, everything remained almost unchanged. The same furniture, the old carpet, the yellowed curtains, and the walls covered with her life. Diplomas, photos, clippings from local newspapers, printed articles from the internet about her career successes, which she didn't even know her father read. In the middle of the living room was a set table, the best dishes, apples from the garden, a bottle of red wine that James only opened on special occasions. "I made soup using your mother's recipe, and pancakes, your favorite." "Thanks, Dad, but I ate on the way," she lied. She didn't see his eyes dim a little. That evening, James took out an old photo album. "I wanted to show you tomorrow, but maybe now." On the first page was a photo from the maternity hospital. Next to it was her mother's neat handwriting. "Our Claire, the most beautiful girl in the world." Then came her whole life. Her first steps, her first day at school, her victories, her defeats. And on the last pages, her adult life, which she had so carefully hidden from him. You were watching me?" she whispered. "Of course, I'm your dad." And at that moment, Claire felt real shame for the first time. Not for him, for herself. The next day, the doctor said something that changed everything. Idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, an occupational disease, a disease caused by years of exposure to chemicals. Claire sat there, unable to feel her legs. Her father was losing his life because of a job she was ashamed of. "How long?" James asked calmly. "A year? Maybe 2?" He just nodded. And for the first time in her life, Claire cried for someone other than herself. That night, James confessed, "I was an engineer once. I worked for a large company. But when you were born, I chose my family." He gave up his career, his dreams, for her sake. In New York, Claire accidentally learned the truth from a business partner. "Are you James Wilson's daughter? He was a genius. We still use his designs." The company offered him a contract, health insurance, the best doctors, and for the first time in many years, James felt needed. Claire returned to New York with a strange feeling in her chest. The city that had once given her strength now seemed cold and indifferent. Glass offices, elevators with mirrored walls, the constant hum of conversation, it all suddenly lost its meaning. Rough, covered in small scars, with darkened nails, hands that held her when she was afraid of the dark, hands that let her go every time she wandered further and further from home. "Claire," her boss addressed her, "are you with us?" "Yes, sorry," she looked up. "I was just thinking." It was the first time in many years that she had really thought about something. Not her career, not ratings, not money. That night, she couldn't sleep. She opened an old mailbox she hadn't used in a long time. There were dozens of letters from her father. Short, awkward, full of concern. "Hi, sweetie. Just wanted to say I'm proud of you. Saw your interview. You looked happy. I made apple pie. Remembered how much you loved it." She never replied to most of them. Claire pressed her hand to her mouth. Tears fell onto the keyboard. She felt ashamed like never before. A few days later, she received a call from the doctor. "Your father's condition is unstable. We need a decision." "I'll come," Claire said without hesitation. She canceled her meetings. She postponed her contracts. For the first time in 10 years, she put her family before her career. When she arrived, James was asleep. He looked older than she remembered, thinner, more fragile. There was a notebook on the bedside table. She didn't want to read it, but she opened it. It was a diary. Not about illness, about her. Claire didn't call again today, but I know she's busy. She's building the life I dreamed of for her. I'm afraid she'll remember me as a burden. If she ever reads this, I want her to know I was happy. Claire closed the notebook and slumped into a chair. She realized He never asked for more than a few minutes of her time. The last few weeks of autumn in River Falls had been particularly quiet. The leaves fell slowly, as if reluctant to touch the ground. James hardly left the house. His breathing became heavier, but his eyes calmer. Claire no longer counted the days. She was just there. She made him breakfast, even though she had never cooked before. She read aloud the news, funny stories from the internet, even advertising flyers, just so he could hear her voice. They watched old movies, and he sometimes fell asleep holding her hand, as if afraid she would disappear again. One evening, he asked, "Bring me that old album." Claire brought it. They turned the pages slowly, as if they were afraid to reach the end. "You are happy here," he said, pointing to a photo of little Claire sitting on his shoulders. "I was always happy. I just didn't always see it," she replied. He smiled. "I always knew you'd come back, even when you didn't call." Her lips trembled. "You weren't angry?" "No, daughter. I was only afraid of one thing, that you would never allow yourself to be real." That night, Claire woke up to silence, too deep. She jumped up and ran to his bed. "Dad?" He was breathing, slowly, almost inaudibly. "I'm here," she whispered, falling to her knees. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." He barely opened his eyes. "I know." He squeezed her fingers for the last time. "Have you forgiven me for not giving you a different life?" Tears dripped onto his hand. "Forgiven you?" Her voice broke. "You gave me the only life that has love in it. I just realized it too late." He closed his eyes with a slight smile. "Then I was a good father. You were the best," she whispered, and the silence became final. The rain started suddenly. It was quiet and light, as if the sky itself was crying with her. Claire stood before people she had never met, but who knew her father better than she did. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Then she said, "For a long time, I was ashamed of my father. Today, I am ashamed of only one thing, that I didn't tell him this sooner." The people were silent. He wasn't rich, he wasn't famous, but he came when he was called. And he stayed, even when he wasn't asked to. Claire paused. "If you're here, it means he touched your life, and I'm grateful to you for showing me who he really was." A year passed. Claire no longer lived in New York. She opened a small help center for people who are usually overlooked. A photograph of James hung on the wall. Underneath it was an inscription: "Kindness doesn't need recognition." One day, a little girl came into the center and asked, "Who is this?" Claire smiled. "This is my father." "Is he a hero?" Claire thought for a moment. "No, he was just kind." We often feel ashamed of those who love us the most, and then we spend our whole lives learning to live with the fact that we didn't say thank you. Sometimes the greatest love is the one we only notice when it's too late.